Welcome back to Shipping Insight 2020. We are entering the decade of defense hosted by Inmarsat. And we are so honored to have the 23rd Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, Admiral Thad Allen, joining us today. Thad currently serves as the James Tyler Chair at the Loy Institute for Leadership at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. He is also a senior executive advisor at Booz Allen Hamilton and HudsonAnalytix, where he supports government and commercial clients in cybersecurity, maritime security, navigation systems, emergency response, and crisis leadership. He's a nationally recognized expert in disaster response, and you will remember him as the hero of Katrina. He also directed the Coast Guard operations in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and the Haitian earthquake. A 1971 graduate of the Coast Guard Academy, Admiral Allen holds a master's degree from George Washington University MIT Sloan School. Please help me welcome Admiral Thad Allen. Thank you very much, Admiral, for joining us. It's an honor.
Morning, Carleen. How are you?
Doing well, thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me this morning. I'd like to pass on a few thoughts that have come to mind over the last several decades of what I've been involved in, but more notably, I think, against the backdrop of what's currently happening globally, not only in maritime transportation, but in terms of the multiple challenges we're facing and the tension between threats that are global, globalization, if you will, both big G and small g, and increasing pockets of isolationist populism and constant forces of tension that companies have to operate in globally around the world today. I'm reminded of Max Bobby's comments earlier regarding cyber crossing all parts of an enterprise, supply chains, and everything else. But I think we need to realize that there are lots of risk and threat vectors out there that are agnostic to national boundaries. And regardless of individual national regulations and protocols and legal frameworks and international frameworks, they still present significant challenge. In addition to cyber, just what we've seen in terms of pandemics, the ability of germs to be transmitted via all kinds of ways. Weather is agnostic to boundaries. We have tremendous migration issues. Supply chains are global. Even the global warming, and you can argue whether it's happening or not, is producing vast amounts of water vapor that are collecting in the atmosphere and moving around to different parts of the world. So evaporation in the Indian Ocean can result in huge flooding, say for Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas. And against all that, there's no silver bullet. The real tension is managing risk against all the other activities that are required. And my counsel to industry leaders, company executives, and so forth is to try and get more involved in things that you have to do anyway for compliance and try and gain better value out of the resources you're investing and participation. For example, if you're required to do an exercise, you should try and get the most senior people you can involved in it, not because it's critical to the compliance. It's critical to establishing pre-need relationships inside the organization that then can be leveraged no matter what the event that you have to face presents a risk to the organization. And the reason I say that is these things are intertwined and become tangled. We have hybrid events. So in the United States recently, we've had to deal with probably the most active hurricane season in the history of the country. At the same time, we are trying to deal with social distancing related to the coronavirus. How do you do an evacuation and set up a shelter when you're trying to do social distancing to reduce the risk? In the same manner, you can't just look at a risk to an organizational structure in compliance with U.S. regulations or IMO treaty conventions to the exclusion of the other lines of effort that you're doing related to cyber, supply chain assurance, and everything else. So the real challenge for the C-suites and for the maritime companies that are operating right now is where you can combine resources against compliance and regulatory requirements to create better participation by senior leaders that includes personal relationships that need to be developed. So when something happens, you're more prepared and you're more resilient. The concept of a qualified individual transferred to other contingencies where they're not required, but that function. What is that function for the organization, regardless of the risk you're facing? And how do you pull all the different resources of the organization together to make a unified response moving forward? And I think in the long run, multilateralism is going to prevail. We're going to see these pockets of resistance to globalization and everything. They're going to fall away ultimately because none of them ever succeeded very long, because globalization itself is something that's going to march forward, because capital is always going to seek its lowest labor markets. And the investors are going to be interested in recovering their investments. And that's going to drive what we do around this world to a great extent. And false barriers set up for whatever reason, politics or whatever, are not going to prevail. Companies that understand that are going to be better positioned, more resilient, and are going to be able to respond better in the event there is an incident. Also, it's really important from a strategy standpoint for these companies to understand that risks are multidimensional. These lines of effort cross each other, and they need to figure out a way to have a more comprehensive and holistic way to look at the entire operating environment they're operating in. And that's anywhere from sulfur emissions to the threat of jamming of position navigation and timing, global navigation satellite systems. Everything out there represents the environment they operate in. And what needs to be done is a thoughtful consideration of how the equities of the organization are being represented and how they prepare for those in creating a resilient organization. One of the watchwords or watch phrases I like to use is the status quo is an oxymoron. We're in a constant state of change in this world. We're all getting older every day. The world's expanding. There are all kinds of issues that are going on all the time. And we can't look at ourselves and our organizations and our structures as being caught in a certain place in time. And I think the dynamic issues associated with where the world is going is going to require us to come together in a holistic sense in how we actually run these countries. Run our organizations. And specifically with the future of maritime transportation in this world, 95% of the goods that come into the United States come via vessel. That's not going to change, but the technology is going to change dramatically. We're already starting to talk at IMO about autonomous vessels. What does this mean for crewing? How do we deal with these multifaceted vectors? And what do we think about the world where we have a chance to look at technology and how it will be implemented before we're regulated into compliance by international bodies or national bodies because we did not seize the opportunity to figure out how we might actually reform ourselves and position ourselves for the future. One of the things I like to say is you should describe and design the future you see yourself in 10 or 15 years from now, then pull yourself towards it rather than incrementally reacting to change. And doing it incrementally, it is less valuable. It's not the most efficient use of resources. And in the long run, you will position your organization much better for risk if you can think about the future moving ahead.
Thad, I have a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
We speak about geopolitical disruption, and we certainly have seen economic disruption. Do you feel that the relationship between corporate or industrial interests and governments is going to change?
I think it has to, and let me tell you the reason why. In the middle of the response to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, it was clear there was obviously there was a tension between the private sector and government because unlike a natural disaster, we had a responsible party. We had a protagonist, if you will. But the real issue there was a long time ago, the U.S. government decided they would not get into the business of oil and gas exploration and the production of fossil fuels. So when that happens and technology changes, and you have a problem, necessarily the means of production to fix the problem are not necessarily going to reside in government. And for that reason, you have to figure out what is the relationship going to be between the government and the private sector to solve the problem. And one of the huge challenges that I had in dealing with the oil spill was trying to negotiate the relationship between BP clear up to the Oval Office, where political leaders wanted to be relevant in the response and relevant to their constituents in solving a problem or being good stewards of government and protecting the public interest. And BP, who saw this as an existential threat to the firm and was trying to solve the problem. And when the government does not own the means of production to fix the problem, the only way you're going to be able to solve this problem that meets the expectations of the American people is co-production of outcomes. So the key to capping the well and the key to dealing with that response was the ability to bridge the gap between the private sector responsibility to using technology, their intellectual capital, and their means to fix the problem, but under the supervision of a government that didn't necessarily have all the technical experts to oversee it. That's a tremendous challenge politically if you think about it for leaders moving forward. And from where I sat, the goal was to figure out what are the proper mix of roles and how do we move this thing forward and how do we meet the expectations of the American people. I think moving forward, there's never going to be a clear-cut answer where government's going to be able to solve it or the private sector is going to be able to solve it. It's always going to be a mix of requirements and capabilities and the role of government and how we deal with it. And I think that is a premier issue moving forward, because as technology changes and changes rapidly, it's going to be acquired, employed, and used for business purposes or mission execution much faster in the private sector than it is in the government. And that puts the onus on government in two ways. Number one, they have to figure out how to acquire that technology and deploy it for their own mission use. And that is going to be slower than the private sector because all the regulatory hurdles they have to jump over. But at the same time, they have to be competent in a regulatory environment to oversee those actions and figure out if there is a regulation needed or how are we going to ensure the safety of the operations and so forth. These things, and they can't be subjected to the regulatory environment we have right now because it's just too slow. There has to be another way to solve these problems and minimize the risk going forward. One of the examples I like to use is the application of Open 90, Oil Pollution Act of 1990 requirements in Deepwater Horizon. I was in the Coast Guard having to put these capabilities online and actually develop regulations and put them in place to implement the requirements of Open 90. And the goal of Open 90 was to put safeguards in, including financial safeguards, that would minimize the possibility of a large tanker accident and then mitigate the impact of it both financially and environmentally. And the fact of the matter is we succeeded to a great extent. There hasn't been a major tanker accident in 30 years in the United States. The problem was the risk shifted offshore when advances in drilling allowed the offshore drilling technology to go deep to the point where we went to war with tools we had created to stop a tanker accident or deal with a tanker issue. And what we were dealing with was an uncontrolled well that was 5,000 feet below the surface. Mm-hmm.
Well,
sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
Thank you so much, Admiral Allen.
Thank you, Carlene. And thank you very much, Admiral Allen. It was very interesting. With each passing decade, the world gets even more dangerous. Shipping is faced with multiple threats, pandemics, geopolitical forces, cyber risks, piracy, and economic security. How is a company to navigate these choppy waters? Well, we're going to soon find out on 2020 News Special Feature with our Chief Correspondent, Mark Warner, Director, Maritime, Inmarsat, with a panel of experts, Boriana Farrer, the American Club, Dr. Will Perez, Moran Cyber, Jim Lawrence, MTI Network, Bud Darr, old buddy of mine, MSC, and Parker Harrison, Crowley Maritime Corporation. Again, thank you, Admiral Allen.
Thank you. So I hope everyone can hear me. If my panelists just nod, that'd be excellent. That's great. Great to hear you. So, good morning. First off, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm in the UK, but I know we've got panelists from around the world, and also a few in the US as well. So it's just gone good afternoon, anyway. So, as Hugh said, my name is Mark Warner. I'm marketing PR director from the maritime satellite company Inmarsat, and I would like to welcome you to Shipping Insight's Decade of Defence Roundtable. It really follows on what we've heard from Thad Allen, and I think over the next 45 minutes, the panel are going to look at various issues, various topics, many of which he actually covered in his speech, and we'll explore and do a deep dive into that. It's not just obviously a decade of defence. There's lots going on at the moment, particularly over the last 6 months with the pandemic. But and I know a lot of my American colleagues and sports commentators over in America say, the best form of defence is offence, right? So it's what are the opportunities as well around the threats that we're seeing. I will just introduce, go round on the screen. So in the top, the left-hand corner, we have Boriana Farrer, VP Business Development at American Club. Next to me at the top of the screen, we have Parker Harrison, Senior VP at Crowley Maritime. Then we have Bud Darr, Executive Vice President, Maritime Policy and Government Affairs at MSC. A man who needs no introduction, Jim Lawrence, MTI Network, and obviously a man perfectly placed to comment on dealings with risk and crises in the shipping industry, having been on the forefront over many years. I'm sure you won't mind me saying that, Jim. And then finally, we have Will Perez from Moran Cyber. Okay, if I can have just the first slide, and it is only one slide. If I can have the first slide, please, that would be good. Okay, it's very hard to see this, so I will have to describe some of this. I'm not sure if we can expand it slightly, but very topical actually. And I know some of the panelists have been involved in the Global Maritime Forum, which kicked off last week. But to kind of precede the forum, the Global Maritime Monitor published their kind of the maritime issues for 2020. And the two real kind of new issues that have suddenly cropped up this year are those two in red, the big circles. One of those is pandemic, and obviously the other one is the global economic crisis. And as you can see, actually, the global economic crisis, or the upcoming global economic crisis, is an issue which this was actually a survey of a number of maritime leaders, and they felt that this was obviously the biggest issue that they were facing over the next decade. And obviously the red shows that they were probably the least prepared for it. And obviously the other big red circle is the pandemic. Now, aside from that, we also have we've also got the environmental side. So up in the top right-hand corner as well, there's some of the kind of decarbonisation as an issue. There's other environmental areas, governance as well, actually, which is in the middle of the slide. And we also have a number of kind of new entries around the role of digitalization. And obviously, certainly from an Inmarsat perspective, we see, yes, there is a threat around digitalization and the technology that brings. And I think Thad Allen obviously touched on autonomy as well. But there's also opportunities. And actually, to give some perspective, since the crisis started, so between March and June of this year, the amount of data downloaded across our 10,000 vessels, which we have on our high-speed internet service, we saw 40% increase. Now, some of that is obviously, and it was actually spoken about in the previous session, some of that was driven by crew and crew internet and crew data usage. But what we also saw was a large increase in the use of applications, remote surveys, which obviously the class societies have been involved in. So there was a real increase, an acceleration, actually, if you put it that way, an acceleration in maritime digitalization. And that has been really evidenced by the data that we've seen, the data volumes, and they continue to grow as well. But of course, digitalization also brings threats. And again, Admiral Allen touched on that in terms of the cyber risks. And I'm sure Will will touch on this too during the panel discussion. But what we saw and what we are seeing is, I think, a 900% increase, and I'll let that sink in, a 900% increase in cyber attacks over the last 3 years. And obviously that alone has its own issues as well. And then the other thing is, obviously, we've got the pandemic, we've got the looming what happens next in the economy. But of course, you've got other things as well. You've got geopolitical issues, from the Iranian sanctions to turbulence in Hong Kong to ground shaping elections, obviously coming up in in less than a month. And then you've got the small matter, well, certainly from our side as well, the small matter of Brexit. So lots going on there. All of those will have repercussions on shipping, but perhaps forgotten slightly in our kind of the era of COVID. So we'll also touch on those too, and I want the panel to go on to that. But without further ado, let's get the thoughts of the esteemed panel. And if you don't mind, I'll start with Parker, actually, from Crowley. So Parker, you've seen there, and it's just, that slide was just to kind of really kick this discussion off. But you can see now that ship owners are looking, they're kind of looking at the risks, and obviously the pandemic and COVID, dominate that slide. But how does this fit in with your risk evaluation as a ship owner?
Well, I mean, certainly, I share a lot of the concerns that are represented here on this slide, and certainly most of these are relevant to our operations as well. Our operations are perhaps a bit different from those maybe that Bud deals with. Crowley's trading footprint is a bit more regional. We focus in the United States, North America, basically. And so some of these are a little bit less pressing for us, if that makes sense. As far as I was concerned, I was impressed by not impressed, rather, I would certainly agree that the environmental regulation was a major issue for us, particularly where you have patchwork or inconsistent regulation, even between states in the United States, where we have California that's been very aggressive in implementing ever more rigorous environmental regulation, and now we see places like New Jersey are starting to follow suit. There are a lot of times that we wish that the federal government would step in and regulate, so we have uniform regulations, at least within the United States. Other countries can certainly do what they want, but that was one of the biggest ones from my perspective.
Okay, and we'll come on to governance in a minute, because I think that's also a real area where there's a lot to be done there as well. I mean, Bud, just on your side, and again, I'd like to get a little bit further in depth around the decarbonisation, but perhaps later in there. But in terms of the major threats there, again from a ship owner perspective, was there anything missing, or does it really tally with what you're seeing?
Well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to be here today with the audience and the rest of the panel, because it's definitely a very interesting panel. An enterprise our size has the luxury of being able to enjoy pretty much each of the things that are on this particular diagram to varying degrees of scale. But I would say that the single most pressing one that probably concerns me, although the things in the upper right, those three, probably I would score the same way, are geopolitical in nature, because those are the ones that we as a commercial enterprise have the very least amount of control over. They're very difficult to plan for, and they can cause disruptions in trade routes. They could cause dangers to our seafarers, dangers to our ships, much less important than the seafarers themselves, and of course the cargoes. And they can lead to many of these other knockoff effects. So, for example, geopolitical tension can very easily lead into trade sanctions and security events that come with that or associated with it, and redistribution of trade routes, which is a great challenge. You have to be ready for it. You have to be able to adapt your network quickly. I will say with the pandemic, we have had different experiences in the different divisions of our company. It's a major, major impact event, no doubt, and I don't think we can yet assess what the ultimate impact is on economic growth or perhaps contraction, if that's sustained, or trade patterns. But with the cruise side of our business, and we're the fourth largest cruise line in the world, it went from a business that couldn't add capacity fast enough to a business that had zero revenue almost overnight. It was a shocking turn of events so quickly. With the cargo side of the business, it was a different amount of a different type of disruption, but it was huge disruption nonetheless. And those that adapted their networks really quickly and changed capacity to match up better with the demand for that capacity, I think have fared much better. And in the container sector this time, unlike 2008, I think that the response has been much more effective in that regard. But the final chapter is not written on that yet, and it's one that really no one saw coming in the short term, or how broad the impacts could be, because not only were they big events that occurred, but they happen on a rolling basis around the world as far as creating mismatches in supply and demand, and even in some cases, changing of trade routes almost instantaneously.
Okay, thanks for that, Bud. And I think that's the point you made there around the 2008 recession, and the kind of, and being prepared better this time if that global economic crisis, as the leaders expect, if that kind of then takes place. And I'll come back to that in a second. Boriana, you've seen, we've heard from the ship owner sides, obviously the risk, you kind of work with them on the risk side. So can you just give, the international group and the kind of from an insurer's perspective, and obviously the IUMI group were behind the slide as well that I put up. Just give your perspective on kind of, how you see it developing, and obviously how you can help ship owners mitigate those issues and those risks. I think we're just waiting for Boriana's audio. Try one more time with Boriana. Yes, we can hear you now.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. So just to follow up on Bud Darr's comments and to analyze the insurance perspective, we have to see that the biggest threat right now, of course, is the pandemic. And traditionally, insurance industry follows shipping. And no matter what shipping faces in terms of risk and risk assessment, the insurance industry follows it, and there is a product or a risk that could be insured. Now, we are seeing unprecedented pandemic in this regard, but when it comes to the way the P&I rules would respond to such risk, they're very traditional and fortunately are well reflected in the international group pooling agreements and the rules there too. Now, just a little background, all the world goods are transported by ships. 90% of them are transported by ships. And 90% of those goods are insured by the international group, or for as a background, a group of 13 clubs that American Club is a part. So when it comes to evaluating and insuring risk, the international group responds to a variety of risks here. But now we have to look at the types of risk. You have illnesses on board the vessels. And in this particular instance, the quarantine rules will respond the traditional way. Specifically, all the expenses on board the ships would be covered. Some quarantine expenses would not, depending whether we have port restrictions. If we have any economic impact, and Bud responded to that question partially, depending on what sector we are in, insurance will respond in a very different way. If you have charter party disputes, certain rules will be triggered. If you have illnesses on board the ships, certain rules will be triggered. If you have port restrictions, again, majority of expenses would be triggered. But now we see our members, which are globally located, really respond very differently around the world. Some of our cruise members have laid up vessels, and we have responded in a way that we have accommodated their sick crew and responded to urgent claims. And some of our members are doing fairly well, even in this crisis, especially on the cargo side. Some of the tanker side, tankers are also operating well. So from this perspective, it depends on the type of risk. But the long story short is that the international group has certain rules that are triggered traditional way. And also international group has reacted in a way to have a map where you can locate certain port restrictions and COVID related regulations and hotspots, which could be found on the international group website. And American Club has been very proactive in this regard, and we have a loss prevention COVID-related page to our members where a lot of answers can be found.
Great, thank you for that, Boriana. Jim, I mean, in terms of the from a your involvement with obviously with MTI Network, in terms of kind of reputational risk and dealing with the reputational risk that comes from these issues. I mean, have things changed? I mean, we did just touch on the 2008. Have things got better in terms of handling reputational risk, or are there still big issues out there that need to be, particularly with this kind of the early part of this decade with those threats starting to be prevalent? Are there still things that ship owners can learn and adjust to? If we can just get some audio on Jim, that would be great.
7 months later, and I still do that. So anyway, I just said thank you, Mark. Thank you, Carlene, and thank you, all of you. Ours, as we'll all recall, is an industry that over the past century has dealt with 2 world wars, a depression, and now 2 pandemics. And yet in the last 2 decades, we've still managed to be a catalyst to help raise 1 billion people up out of poverty. So some of the challenges we've been talking about, such as geopolitics and pandemics, are largely outside of our control, if not the constant worry of management. Others, like financial swings, piracy, and more recently cyber, call for the fundamental truth important in any crisis and any business management scenario. And that is a fundamental belief that in doing the right thing, a complete commitment to the safety and betterment of our people, a daily pursuit of performance metrics on environmental safety, client-focused services and financial balance sheet and mutually aligned equity decisions, all of which are commitments to doing the very best every day. But there's something more, because the best of our community pursue just what I outlined every day, and all of us in this business can be, and I know amongst all my fellow panelists today, are proud of that. But we have a saying in the response business, to go back to Admiral Allen, that you can be doing everything right down on the waterfront to take care of a problem, but if you're not effectively communicating to the community that's been impacted, well, you've only done half the job. There are dozens of reasons why our industry does not communicate well, all that it does. We're ship owners. It's our business to move cargoes from here to there. Our interaction with the media is frequently tense, generally only around problems, incidents, and accidents. We're multicultural, multilingual, we're global, and custom around media and public communications are complicated. I'm proud, no matter the circumstances, to talk about and represent our industry, but communications is a craft. Indeed, it's an art, and like any skill, takes time, practice, confidence, and objectives. We can be good at selling a company's value proposition, but we can be better, much better, and this is the point, at selling the value propositions of all that the women and men in this business on ships and ashore around the world are doing for humanity every day. Further, as we as an industry take a leadership role in combating climate change and getting to zero, I know that my friends on the panel here, colleagues that we've heard before, people around the world in this business are going to rise to the occasion and communicate effectively. I talk to them every day. We've heard more today from everybody else, and it's a thrill. And I think that's our challenge and our opportunity.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Jim. And it again, thought-provoking words. And finally, so Will, I just want to kind of bring you into kind of the first round of discussion here. You know, a lot of the things, and as Jim says, a lot of the things, you know, we've been talking about for a while. Obviously, pandemics come and go, yes. But let's just talk about, you know, the rise of digitalization, you know, the autonomy coming, you know, and as I mentioned, obviously, you know, it's being accelerated through COVID as well. But of course, that brings its own threats, and you know, 900% increase in cyber attacks. I mean, yeah, is shipping ready? I know there's regulations coming, but it still seems to be that shipping is still thinking that this cyber thing, you know, that's not really important. So, what's your view on that threat?
I think that from my experience in working with passenger vessels and now with different types of maritime customers, is that you know, shipping agencies and shipping in general are operating under very tight budgets. So cybersecurity spending may not be one of the top priorities, especially now with the pandemic. It just exacerbates the situation. I think you know, in some of the cyber attacks we've seen in the last couple months, really it's been around operational impact, either things as simple as email not operating or websites not being available. Ransomware is pretty prevalent. And a lot of times when you see incidents that occur at sea, they're not reported, either because it's not known that it's a cyber incident until later on in investigations. So, you know, that's been my take. In doing assessments and in doing really, let's say, penetration testing on board vessels, there definitely needs to be a lot of work done in terms of just basic security. What regulation can do is in the least provide a baseline effort in a standard to at least try to shoot for. It doesn't guarantee they're going to be secure. It just means that you at least have a way, like a mark that you need to shoot for. In terms of digitization, I've been working in the last few years on efforts to do things like predictive maintenance, remote monitoring, and just your typical VPN into corporations. Now with COVID and everybody working remote, that even becomes a bigger necessity. So I'm sure on the satellite site, you might maybe have seen an increase in bandwidth usage, not just from crew, using the internet, but it could be in moving data from the vessel to do things like get operational insight in terms of what's happening on the ship. And also doing remote maintenance. I've seen that a lot with, especially with restrictions of crew movement and being able to board a vessel, is marine suppliers are, if they're able to go in and remotely diagnose a system, it would prevent someone from having to go on the ship and do maintenance that would typically be done at port. So that's been my experience in terms of what's the trending that's going on right now. I do believe that there has to be a greater effort in terms of visibility within the maritime space. And what that means is owners and executives that oversee programs to really understand what are the risks within their environment. And usually that begins with an assessment. If they've already done an assessment and they're going through remediation work, it's really how to prioritize the effort in order to maximize its delivery. So for example, right now, if remote access is one of those things that need to be addressed first, I'd probably address those kind of concerns and those risks first versus some other low-hanging fruit that may be out there. I would also look at improving the resiliency and operational effectiveness of an organization. For example, if you get attacked, let's say by ransomware, and your email servers go down, that would be pretty impactful if that's how you depend on communicating with ships and with delivering products, or if it's some sort of e-commerce system or some sort of supply chain application that gets impacted. I would look in to make sure that those systems are identified in terms of their priority, why they're important within the business, and then identifying what are the weaknesses that could basically bring the system down. And then if there are ways around to work around those systems outages, how would that work? Like some companies, when they got impacted, they started using Gmail for email correspondence as a backup. It's not effective, but at least they were able to continue operating until their systems got back to service.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that, Will, and it's a good view. And I guess as a follow-up question to that, obviously with the IMO regulations coming, is cyber going to, are the, once people start complying to the IMO regulations, 2021 regulations, will you see a kind of cyber will become just part of the norm? Or do you think that because of the, ever-changing and morphing kind of cyber threats, that it will continue to kind of carry on, for the rest of the decade and up to 2030?
Well, do you want me to start?
Well, yeah, let's go with you, Boriana, to start with, and then we'll flip back to Will, and then I want to ask a few questions around decarbonisation. But why don't you take that one, Boriana?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Just to clarify, so from January 31st, 2021, IMO's regulations come into force, which essentially mandate the owners to incorporate cybersecurity plan in their SMS. So the short answer to your questions will be yes, they will have to comply with it, because from an insurance standpoint, if they don't, they might prejudice their cover. And in this regard, cyber risk, if I can comment on this, cyber risk is generally not excluded by any P&I rules, and it will be addressed the way it arises. As a practical matter, we see that a lot of our membership are over-prepared, and a lot of them are really not looking at this still in depth. So you can see things across the board. I pulled some statistics here, and I actually saw that during the pandemic, we have 20 to 30,000 threats more than usual course of business. So it's interesting that the owners are squeezed between IMO 2020, one cyber regulations, the pandemic, and preceding that one, IMO 2020 as to ballast water regulations. And it seems that the owners are carrying a big burden here as to operational costs to comply with it. But when it comes to cyber risk, I think that the risks will increase significantly, and the owners will have to really be very proactive in this regards. And from our standpoint, we are currently doing an initiative with ABS Group. We're very excited about it. And we are preparing our owners in terms of risk management as to, again, one of our loss prevention initiatives. And with that, I'll give the floor to others to respond.
Excellent. Thank you, Boriana. And so, Will, I mean, with that regulation, 5 years time, is that, the impact and the kind of the threat level, will we see cyber much further, less impactful? Or do you think that, this, it will continue and the regulations will just be the first step and other things will have to develop after that?
When I look at regulations, I look at how other cybersecurity regulations that impacted the industry. So, for example, if you see how PCI developed over time, the payment card industry, you had some major breaches that really caused the credit card companies to really put hefty fines on merchants that weren't meeting compliance requirements. And you look at now, you may hear about a breach here or there, but not as frequently as you did in the past, mainly because organizations started taking it more seriously. That doesn't mean that companies are not challenged to meet compliance requirements. One of the stats that I had read when I was dealing a lot with PCI standards was that most companies, even after being PCI compliant, fell back 20%. Mainly because, just either because systems became obsolete or, some security controls got kind of lax. So it's like a constant race you got to keep, meeting, right? Like it just never ends, it seems. I think with with maritime industries, they really haven't been hit with that kind of regulation where they're like, oh, we have to do this. Like until someone gets fined or there's like a major breach and everybody seems to be having it, it doesn't seem to hit the radar. And, you know, it's not because, how do I say, like, it's just human nature. I sometimes feel that, you know, it's until it doesn't happen to you physically. It's kind of like if we would have talked about pandemic planning, you know, 3 years ago, people would have been like, yeah, whatever. Like, okay, you know, it could happen, you know, people always going to look at things that could happen, but until it doesn't happen and it's not in your front door, you don't really take it seriously. So I think, you know, regulations is great, right? And they help push the envelope. But I think until you don't start seeing more and more companies impacted operationally or reputationally, that people are not going to take it seriously as well as it could be. I mean, that's, you know, you see, you know, like I've worked with other class societies, like, for example, I worked with DMVGL doing a lot of assessments. And, you know, when you do your first assessment, it looks ugly, right? And then you get better the next time, but you have to start somewhere, right? Until you don't start, you don't know where you're at. So you need to really kind of figure out where you're at. And then you work with a lot of the marine suppliers to fix a lot of issues. Because a lot of times it's not even the owner, it's a lot of times the systems that you get delivered. So if you're not requiring the marine suppliers to fix issues, they're not going to do it for free, right? Like they're not going to do it because they're, you know, it's a business that they're running. So if you're asking for cybersecurity requirements, it's going to increase the cost because you got to secure it, you got to harden it, you got to add more things to it that you normally didn't have before. So it's a partnership between the client, the supplier that's providing the system, and whoever is managing that system. So, you know, if you only have 2 or 3 people that are managing the IT infrastructure, you're going to be stretched if you're just kind of adding cybersecurity on top of it. So you got to figure out smart ways to do it. And, you know, there's a lot of technology out there that's being deployed that I think, you know, reduce that overhead that in the past would have been economically not as feasible. So, for example, you have a lot of things that are cloud-based now that doesn't require a lot of overhead to maintain because it's kind of maintained in the cloud. But then that adds other requirements like satellite, you know, like, for example, if you're using an endpoint security tool that may be cloud-based, it requires more satellite or more network bandwidth than you would in the past. So it may not be conducive for everybody to use, you know, a certain type of technology because there might be other constraints.
Okay, thank you for that, Will. So one issue that hasn't obviously just, you know, been started to really arise over the last 3 years is obviously decarbonisation, where, you know, it's been talked about for a long time. And then obviously we've had the other IMO, the IMO 2020 rules starting to come into force. So, Bud Parker, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts in, you know, some people say, well, because of what's happened, because of the COVID pandemic, you know, decarbonisation has been taken slightly off the agenda. You know, it was at the forefront January this year. Every maritime newspaper, everything you read online, it was all about decarbonisation and what was happening, how it was going to happen, et cetera, and then of course COVID happened. You know, so the question to both of you really is, you know, has it really been taken off the agenda? And, you know, and what are you, as kind of very progressive ship owners, both regional and international across sectors as well, what are you doing? What policies are you putting in place to make sure it is on the agenda and very much kind of the focus from your C-suite? So why don't we start, Parker, why don't we start with you on that one?
Thank you for not making me follow Bud on this topic. I appreciate it. So certainly the focus on decarbonization has not really taken a backseat. I mean, you know, the tyranny of the urgent has sometimes lets us focus on the most critical problem at hand, which has been responding to the pandemic and keeping our people safe. But the long view of decarbonization across our entire spectrum of operations, not just vessel operation, but also trucking and all sorts of other things that we're involved in, has continued apace. We have a number of measures that are in place for members of Clean Cargo. We have established a program to start to track and document our emissions, both from our vessels and from our terminals ashore and from our trucks. And some of our more sophisticated, our larger commercial customers on the logistics or the liner side have really led this for us for a number of years, wanting to get down to the individual RLU. What are the emissions from that single RLU? Which it took us a while to get up to the point where we could actually provide that information, and Clean Cargo has provided a great resource for us to be able to estimate that. There are a number of things that we're involved in that I could describe to you, including our two LNG fueled Conroe vessels that are dedicated to the Jacksonville, Florida, Puerto Rico trade, getting involved in LNG microgrids in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, and supply for a less a fuel source that creates less SOx, less particulate than other traditional fuels. But also we're in discussions fairly recently with some of our customers about decarbonization efforts and industry groups that can work together on things that are more specific maybe in North America to attempt to accomplish the IMO's emissions regulations.
Okay, thank you very much, Parker. And Bud, would you like to, from your perspective, for those kind of naysayers who are saying, that, no, let's put it, too much is going on, let's put decarbonisation on the shelf for 1 or 2 other years. I mean, what do you have to say about that? And kind of what's your kind of, from an MSC perspective, what are you doing? And is that, and I'm pretty sure it isn't, but if you'd like to give us the kind of overview on the policies that you're putting in right here and right now, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think Parker's comments were very good. The short answer to the question is absolutely not has decarbonization fallen somehow into the background just because we happen to be in a world-altering pandemic at the moment. Somehow, the proponents on the regulatory front have managed to even step up their momentum. But in fairness, they're addressing a very serious problem, and we need to as well. Here where I sit in Geneva, which, ironically is right in the geographical heart of Europe, but outside the EU, you tend to have a different perspective on the external drivers for this than you do if you're in North America. And what I mean by that is it's not only the regulators, which are just on a completely different level on this issue than what we see in many other countries, but in particular in the United States, but also our customers who have their own sustainability goals and plans and KPIs that they have to live into, and their own customers that they've got to answer to, and their shareholders they've got to answer to, are putting an increasing amount of pressure on us to decarbonize as quickly as possible. It's either part of your corporate ethos, or it will become that if you're in our business, because the customers are demanding it and the regulators are still going to force it. So right while we were in the heart of dealing with the pandemic is when some of the largest initiatives in the EU really started to get moving because the new presidency had come in. And for those who've worked in the IMO for as long as I have, you know that when you have 27 member states all lined up in one direction, and they have to be by definition on an issue like this, they have a really good chance of driving the dialogue and the end result at the IMO. And so if you don't work it at the regional level, you're really doing a disservice when it comes to IMO, because it's not as if it's very feasible that IMO will come in later, do something completely different, and all of a sudden we'll have a completely separate regulatory regime and the EU one will go away. I don't think that's realistic at all. Unfortunately, don't think that's what's going to happen. So you have to work both in parallel path. And I think it's really important for us as an industry to shoulder the responsibility. Yes, it's true. The number I believe is we're a little over 2% of the anthropogenic loading in the atmosphere of CO2 at the moment, but it's 2% plus that matters. And it is a growing proportion over time because we are beholden to the trade patterns. We provide a service that's essential to world trade. And right now, we don't have the means to increase energy efficiency or greenhouse gas efficiency fast enough to overcome what are the likely increases in trade over the coming couple of decades. We have to get there. But we're not in the business of designing and delivering new fuels. We're not in the business of designing new propulsion systems. That's not what we do. But we stand ready and able to take risk, to partner up with those who are delivering that, and we're doing it on many different levels. Right now, today, you've got basically three options: energy at scale, energy efficiency, LNG, and biofuels. In our company, we're doing all three. It's not either or. We have a major commitment to LNG, about 5 billion euro so far in our cruise division. We look at it continuously in our cargo division, but we haven't quite found the formula to this point where it works for us there. Energy efficiency, absolutely across the board, which helps a lot. And then biofuels, we're right now routinely bunkering as a substitute completely for all of our 0.5 and 0.1% sulfur content fuels in Rotterdam. We're bunkering with up to 45% biofuel blends. So we're doing all we can do, I think, right now, and we're continuing to press ourselves there, but that's not going to get us to 50% absolute by 2050, particularly if the trade patterns, evolve positively. We need new fuels. We need new propulsion technologies, and the R&D effort and commitment of both energy and capital to make that happen has to have already started. It needs to happen with greater and greater intensity now, or we're never going to meet our own expectations, those of society, and those of the policymakers who are accountable to them.
And thanks for that, Bud. And
I think we'll get there.
Unfortunately, yeah, good. And so you also, because of the topic, do you think we'll get there by 2030? That's the question, right?
Well, there's various benchmarks. If you're talking about the 40% carbon intensity by 2030 that IMO set out, it's going to be challenging for some segments, but I think we will get there as a sector, as the shipping sector, for 2030. 2050, which is 70% intensity compared to 2008, or 50% absolute, especially by 2050, without a breakthrough in something that's still a bit over the horizon and that we can't go out and buy and put on our ships, won't happen. So we need that. I think it will come, and I think some of the right things are happening, but they've really got to happen with a seriousness and commitment from all the stakeholders. Industry can't do this on our own, and our industry particularly can't do it on its own. It needs a further commitment from the academic community and particularly governments. I'm not a big fan of unnecessary government intervention, but this is a time when intervention of capital and seed money and commitment from the policy perspective to help catalyze that growth is really needed. Because without it, I don't know how the energy providers and the people that design propulsion systems are going to get there as fast as we need them to get there. They need that boost.
Okay, thanks for that, Bud. So unfortunately, we're reaching the end. So I would like to get, just before I get one line of where we will be at 2030, and and also what's the biggest opportunity, and it will have to be one line, unfortunately. Jim, from your perspective, you won't mind me saying, obviously you've seen the ups and downs of shipping over many years. What is the biggest opportunity for shipping from your perspective in the next 10 years?
Well, I think Parker and Bud identified it. It is achieving this miraculous climate change, contribution to the globe. For an industry that suffers a reputational deficit disorder generally, imagine all of us being at the pointy end of actually making an effective change. I feel very proud and confident listening to Parker and Bud and all of you today that we'll be there. So that's my hope.
Okay. Boriana, what's the biggest opportunity for shipping over the next 10 years? What do you see it is in your eyes?
Well, certainly for shipping, I would say one word: innovation. And for insurance industry, I would underline that the insurance P&I cover will continue to work in traditional ways, but the insurance industry will continue to come up with new products to ensure a response to the shipping needs. And on a personal level, I just want to say that in 10 years, I expect to be somewhere on an island, somewhere warm.
Good. Thank you. And Parker, very briefly, unfortunately, as we run out of time, from your side, I mean, what do you think from an owner perspective, biggest opportunity?
Well, I had a different answer planned, but after hearing the conversation evolve today, I have to agree with Jim. Being a real contributor on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, I think is really where our opportunity lies.
Thank you. And Bud, anything further to add? Obviously, we touched on decarbonisation, but any other kind of opportunities, areas for opportunities for the maritime industry in the next 10 years?
Sure, it's going to take a couple of words. I can't do it in one like Boriana, but I think it's to continue to be the force for good for society, to improve livelihoods, to foster trade, and in turn foster relationships between governments and between regions, and more importantly, and it's my hope, but to overcome the problem Jim described so well, that we do a far better job of helping the public understand that, and not just us, but our seafarers, the 1.2 million that are out there every day, are doing that job on behalf of the whole of society.
Thanks, Bud. And Will, the last word, so to speak.
I would say that digital transformation is going to be very impactful for all industries, especially around the leveraging of data and the storing of it, and how to automate things, automate processes, and how to do that safely so that you don't get breached or attacked. So the coordination between digital security, design, and innovation.
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, I mean, obviously we've talked about the threats, but yes, the opportunities around innovation, climate change, working together, collaboration. So it just, I'd like to thank the panel. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and it isn't just about, how do we defend the shipping industry? It's obviously there's things there which we can shape and change the shipping industry in the 10 years to come. So thank you very much, panel. Thank you for all your thoughts and insights. And it's been very good to host it. Thank you. And again, thanks to SHIPPINGInsight and Carleen. Thank you very much, everyone.